Shadiversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and if you have ever seen medieval style architecture, whether this was in a documentary, a movie, TV show, whatever, right, you probably will have noticed something very peculiar and distinct about them. And that is on any floor above the first floor, so generally second floor, and it can go, continually up, that the floor above the lower ones are extended out a little bit further than the line of the wall beneath. And so the walls on the higher stories up are extended out, and then sometimes it goes up again and they're extended out again. I'm sure you've seen this before. It is very much a distinct characteristic and style of medieval architecture. Well, if you've seen it, have you ever wondered why? Why on earth were the buildings built like this? Well, I'm here to help you with that question, because in this video I'm going to tell you why. And also, guess what? It has a name! That's right! This style on medieval architecture, or really on any building, but it's more prominent on medieval architecture, is called jettying. Now, the thing about jettying is that that is more applied to timber architecture, but there is a very comparable design style on stone architecture. Now, I have not been able to confirm whether it's called jettying when it's done on stone, but it's done on medieval castles as well. And this has come up in a lot of my castle videos because the reason for it being done on castles is somewhat different, sometimes the same, as the reasons why it's done on timber buildings. So let's get into the reasons why. First, I'll cover the timber, cottages and stuff, and then we'll get to stone for chateaus, castles, and things like that. The first kind of obvious reason as to why jettying was done on medieval buildings and stuff was that it offers more room on the higher up stories. Now, this is important when the footprint of a building was restricted in terms of space, if it was really close to other buildings, if it was in a built up area. But in terms of buildings, there is always space out in front of them because the door needs room to open up into. Usually they open onto a street. And so therefore, if you have restricted space down, as soon as you build one floor up, you can extend the second floor a bit over onto the street. And this was done very often in medieval cities. Interesting just side note about medieval cities. Before transportation became widely accessible to large amounts of people, the main way in which they got around was walking. Now, when you have an area where there's a lot of people crammed together, this can create issues in regards to making just it livable for the people, because everything that they need to live on needs to be in walking distance. And so therefore, to get the people closest to the things they need and the things they need close to the people, they crammed the people as close together, which reduced the walking distance that they needed to walk to get food and other necessities of life. And so that's why medieval cities and stuff like that were often very, very cramped. Because remember, if you don't build up, you have to build out, which increases walking distance between the things that you need. But building up, there's a big advantage to it. And then if you're restricted in space between everything, if you go up, extending out on the street, and then every story going up above that, you can get additional floor space than what you were initially allotted or allowed to get away with based on the actual footprint of the building itself. The part where this answer doesn't make complete sense is when you have, areas where the footprint wasn't restricted, like in more rural country areas. Then, you could make the house as big as you would want, on the foundation. So why did you make it smaller or have the size and then purposely go for bigger going up? Well, another possible reason is that any type of building, when you're actually building it on the ground, you need to support it, usually with stumps, depending on the type of architecture to build. So therefore, the bigger footprint that you're making, the more stumps you need, which creates some more fiddly process. Because if you ever tried to put in stumps, it's not too difficult, but it's not easy either. But in any regards, you save yourself work and effort by making the bottom level as big as it needs to be, And then when you jetty, the next floor above it, you just get more room on top of it.
Another way in which stone buildings were often done in the medieval period is that the bottom floor actually didn't have a floor. Instead, there was a stone frame of the external walls, which would then support the primary habitable dwelling part, which would be the floor. And so the lower level would be a place to store things, also animals would live there. And as I mentioned, the upper floor would be where the people actually lived. This offered a couple of advantages. One of the primary ones being is that you didn't need to put any parts of the wood into the ground, because wood that isn't treated properly, and of course in the medieval period it was just raw timber, when exposed to consistent moisture will rot after a couple of years quite easily. And so when you had timber buildings that were built on wooden stumps, they wouldn't last very long because of that. And so stone foundations were always better. And by not having a floor near the ground, you can avoid the necessity of having timber stumps supporting it, and therefore avoid the problem with rotting. Sometimes there were floors on lower levels, don't get me wrong, but the ones that lasted longest would be the ones that were actually built on a proper stone foundation. And so it would be better for them to have stone floors, in this case on the lower level. Now, stone being more costly meant that having a larger footprint on the lower level would of course cost more. So it would be as big as you could afford, but timber being far more plentiful and cheaper, as soon as you get to the next story up where you can go full timber and not risk any of the rotting issues with the timber being close to the ground, you can make a much bigger floor plan than the one beneath it. So you would jetty the timber frames out in extension from the stone walls underneath. And this is again a very common feature with this type of buildings, where the first floor of these buildings, not always, but the first floor of these buildings would be made out of stone, and the second floor and above would be timber framed.
The other possible reason and explanation as to why jettying was developed in this time period was an architectural kind of advantage. You see, when you have a big bit of beam spanning, the roof between the two walls, okay, well, that timber will want to sag. Weight, gravity, okay, basic physics. So the way that you can prevent this sagging is by putting a counterweight on the other end. But if the timber is just sitting on the wall itself, there's no room to put a counterweight on it. But if you extend that joist, okay, over the wall that it's resting on, now there'll be weight pushing down in the middle, which could, make it sag. But then if you put, a weight on the furthest end, well, that creates a counter force that can work against the weight of the joist itself, but also the floor that you put on top of it, and then everything you put on top of that, well, furniture and people walking on top of it. Well, this can actually create a more stable structure and floor for the upper levels overall. And of course, the other possible reason is that it just looks good. Okay, it's really interesting how we humans determine what is visually pleasing to the eye and not. And we generally like some level of complexity and sophistication, so long as it's balanced and in a certain type of symmetry. That will create beauty to us, right? And so just seeing a flat wall, it's not that interesting, but having that slight difference where it's halfway up and then got the extension, and then you have either the joist supporting it or even corbels if it's stone and stuff like that, it creates a view that is far more visually interesting than it was before. So yes, they could have done it again, like for the reasons that I've mentioned, and because it looked cool. And the funny thing is, I've loved it. How this looks. Ever from the first time I saw medieval cottages or this style of architecture, I thought it looks brilliant, combined with the other styles as well, specifically the timber frames and how it's got the whitewash, the daub and then whitewash in between, which just looks really good. So then, why was this jettying seemingly duplicated on stone architecture, specifically castles? Well, first of all, anyone who, if you're familiar with my channel and you enjoy watching my castle videos, you already know the answer to this, so I do ask you to just bear with me while I explain it to those who probably don't know the answer. First and foremost, it's a defensive feature on castle walls. Now, on a castle wall, you have the wall and then you have an area that people walk atop of. That's called the rampart. Now, for people who are atop the ramparts, they will be there trying to prevent bad guys from getting in, because that's the purpose of a castle, okay? To stop bad guys getting in and also be able to repel them. And they don't want to stand there just completely out in the open, so they developed, well, this part was not developed in the medieval period. Crenellations, which is the defensive part on the top of walls, that was developed far before the medieval period. The Romans had crenellations, okay? And that's where you have a big stone kind of block which provides full cover from arrow fire and any other types of projectiles, and then you have a gap, a crenelle, in between these stone blocks where you can lean out and fire back at bad guys. And so the stone blocks are called merlons, and the gaps in between are called crenelles, and altogether they're called crenellations. Now, they're great, okay, but there's a problem with crenellations, and that's when people get too close. Because when they're too close, unless you lean right out in the open and shoot down, you're not going to be able to get them. And oftentimes, crenellations are too big and bulky for you to lean out and get your bow out, and so that actually gives people cover who are right up against the wall. The answer to this is pretty awesome, in my opinion, and that is extend the battlement itself out off the rampart a bit so it overhangs, and it overhangs just like jettying on timber buildings and such. But that's going to do nothing unless there are some holes that they can actually shoot through. So this is the battlement and this is the wall. The battlement is not just extended off so much that there's a gap in between. And then they have corbels that the battlement rests upon, and in between the corbels are holes that rocks can be thrown down, or you can just shoot straight through them to get at anyone who's right up against the wall. These holes are called Machicolations. They are one of the most iconic and identifying features about a castle. Now, I appreciate you guys who already knew the answer for sticking with us throughout, because now we're going to get into some areas that I haven't covered before in regards to this design feature of extending battlements off, the actual walls of castles. Because there are historical examples, period examples, so castles from the medieval period that had these battlements extended without functional machicolations. Now, it's funny. At first, when I read up on what machicolations were, when I first saw battlements extended off walls, I thought that was really stupid. And in part, I still kind of do. And when I saw video games have this and not have proper, defensive machicolations there, I called them out as being a mistake. Specifically, I did it in my review of Skyhold from Dragon Age Inquisition. Well, now I do need to kind of clarify that and admit that I was a bit out of context when I was saying here, because I have since discovered this was also done on historical castles. Historical castles from the medieval period, this extension existed without functional machicolations either. Well, first of all, I need to point out, when battlements are extended without machicolations in between the holes, this actually amplifies the original problem, because you're just making the angle more difficult for you to fire down anyone against the wall. So this can be without machicolations, this can be a big defensive detriment. If it's on a wall where the attackers will not actually get that close, there's no problem. And so if there's no problem in that, why would you still want to do it? Two main reasons, okay? First of all, sometimes the ramparts were very, very cramped, okay? Depending on the thickness of a castle wall. Now, castle wall thickness, there's a standard and then there are exceptions. If you want a good defensible castle wall, you're going to want it thick, minimum meter thick, and that's just on any wall. If it's the wall of a keep facing an area that isn't really at threat, generally you still want it a full meter thick. On actual external walls, at least 2 meters thick and more. Are there exceptions of walls being thinner? Of course, but if you want the standard and have the adequate level of, structural strength for the castle, you're gonna want it at least, meter thick. Now, if there's actually a wall, especially if this is the external wall of a keep, they can often be only a meter thick. That wall is going to be what will create the rampart atop it. And then if you want a proper battlement, which is going to be maybe 20 to 30 centimeters thick, that leaves a very small amount of room for you to actually walk along. One person could get away with it, but as soon as you come up to another person, there's not going to be much room for you to pass each other. So there is a functional reason why you might want to extend the battlement off the rampart a bit, just to create more room to walk. So this is one reason why it makes sense to do this architectural style without defensive Machicolations. If you add Machicolations on top of it, I think it's, because this is the interesting thing, if you're going to extend it, okay, and go to the trouble of having to do the architecture, you've got to add the corbels to support the things, it's almost, in my mind, the exact same work to add defensive Machicolations as well. So I don't know why you wouldn't if that was the case. There is another case where you wouldn't, and that is when it's not extended far enough. And so there are some cases, historical castles, where the battlement was extended very, like by about that much only off the side of the wall. Now when the battlement, so yeah, crenellation stuff are extended that much, it doesn't really need corbels to support it, because most of it, because if it's this big and it's only moving, you know, maybe a third off the wall, most of the weight is still sitting on the wall and it'll be perfectly stable. You won't really need corbels to support it. And if that's the case, the battlement isn't extended far enough to provide, you know, Machicolations anyway, so you wouldn't be able to add them. But then I want, like, the odd thing about this is that with such a small, you know, extension of the battlement, it won't really create extra room on the rampart either. So why was it done? Come back to that same answer that was mentioned with the buildings. It looks good. It looks really good. The other thing is, because the true origin of this style of architecture on castles was a proper military function, right? It has that same kind of look and implication. Even if they're not real, it still has that. It makes it, I don't know, it makes it look more prestigious, more military in that sense. So one of the examples of a castle that has the battlement and, you know, the upper parts of towers and walls, like a really small extension, is Kidwelly Castle. So have a look at some of these shots here. Again, the upper battlement, there is an extension there that really has no functional purpose at all. The only reason, because it wouldn't be providing extra room for the rampart of any significant level, so the only conclusion that I can come to as to why it was put there is that it looks good. And it really does. Like honestly, it creates a visual difference. Just a flat plain wall, kind of boring, but just having that small border up at the top, it makes it look so much better. So interestingly, the true origin of, you know, these upper battlements having, you know, a slight overhang, small extension from the wall underneath was a military and defensive feature, but then it became a visual iconic style of this architecture. And so when people wanted their buildings to look castle-like, they just copied that style but didn't really go all the way. They just want it to kind of look that way, and that became more common the closer you get to even the modern day. You can have a look at all these castle-like houses that are made to look, you know, like castles but aren't real defensive fortified castles. This is one of the most common features you will see on towers and walls. Those crenellation battlements are always, there's a border line underneath them where they extended just even slightly, sometimes more, sometimes less, but there's a slight extension of them sitting just a little bit out from the wall underneath. And it's all for that iconic look. But just remember, if you want a castle to be properly fortified and capable of defending itself to its best ability, you don't want to do the visual one. You want to do the proper Machicolations, or as I like to say, Machicolations!